Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. I'm Mike Sfraga. I'm the director of the Polar Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I am pleased you could join us today, along with hundreds of others, colleagues of ours, for this informative program entitled Mapping the Changing Climate in the Polar Regions. I want to thank our friends and colleagues at Oguna Corporation from the village of Wainwright in Alaska for their support of our work throughout the years. I also want to express our appreciation to the Embassy of Finland to the United States for their continued and fruitful partnership and friendship. I also thank our colleagues at the United Nations and the world of this important program. We have an outstanding panel of experts today with us to share their expertise and their insights. Each speaker will provide opening remarks and engage in follow-up questions. I encourage my colleagues watching to please participate in this program by emailing your questions to polar@wilsoncenter.org, polar@wilsoncenter.org. Let's make this a participatory program. As our website noted, as climate change accelerates and the Arctic becomes more accessible and more important, perhaps now more than ever, there is a growing realization that the Antarctic region too is increasing in global importance. So there is a need, we believe, for more discussions about these two unique, but in many ways interrelated and interconnected regions. Arctic countries share a commitment to protecting the environment of the Arctic, as well as the Antarctic region, where many environmental, geopolitical, natural resource, and scientific activities are becoming increasingly more important. Finland and the United States, as well as the United Nations, share a commitment to increasing Arctic and polar scientific cooperation, as well as responsibility to create awareness about the pace and impacts of climate change in the regions. We are so pleased to join the Embassy of Finland and the World Meteorological Organization for a discussion exploring the new ways science and technology can assist the UN, can assist Finland and the United States to address the challenges presented in both of these most consequential regions. It is in this context that I now present Ms. Heli Hupia, Counselor Section for Sustainable Growth and Commerce, Embassy of Finland in Washington, D.C., for her opening comments. Heli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm happy to cover what I believe is the most interesting portfolio at the Embassy of Finland to the United States in Washington, D.C. Policies related to the Arctic, climate, and green economies. On behalf of the Embassy, I would like to welcome everyone to today's event and thank Dr. Sfraga and the Wilson Center Polar Institute for your cooperation, not just today, but the close cooperation we've shared over the years and will continue to have for many years to come, I know. Mike, Ambassador Bolton, Evan Bloom, colleagues, your institute does such an important job in successfully bringing visibility to the significance of the Arctic and polar regions in global policy, whether in climate science and policy, sustainable economic developments, or geopolitics. Finland and our embassy shares that priority. The Arctic is never absent in our discussions with interlocutors here in the United States. Finland and the US are both Arctic countries, and there are only 8. As you mentioned, Mike, the region's importance globally is rising. Finland has just set new Arctic priorities, very much focused on the pillars of climate action, the well-being of Arctic inhabitants, and sustainable economic development of the region. We look forward to working together on these teams with our partners here in the US. We've just returned from an excellent visit to Alaska, where a delegation from the Finnish and Norwegian embassies traveled together. Mike, your participation in the program and insights on the trip were priceless. Also funny, as you always are, but priceless in the sense of invaluable insight connecting the dots from the US Arctic to us in the Nordics. And finally, I would like to warmly thank the panelists today. We're proud and happy to have in the panel Finns and honorary Finns that are distinguished experts in their fields, Professor Petteri Taalas, Ambassador Petteri Vuorimäki, and Mr. TJ Mattimore from a global Finnish forerunner company, Vaisala. I look forward to listening to your discussion And I hope we have many viewers joining today. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Heli. And it's always good to have a mix of good content, but a sense of humor as well. And I appreciate you and our colleagues from Norway coming to the state of Alaska and finding so many connections between the US, Alaska, Norway, and Finland. And it was priceless on both sides. So thank you for that. As Heli noted, we have 4 distinguished colleagues with us today. Dr. Petri Talas, Secretary General, World Meteorological Organization. Ambassador Petri Vuotimäki, Finland's Ambassador for Arctic and Antarctic Affairs and Senior Arctic Official for the Arctic Council. Mr. Timothy J. Matamore, or TJ Matamore, President of ISLA, as Heli noted. And my friend and colleague, Mr. Evan Bloom, Senior Fellow at the Polar Institute. Many of you know that Evan served as the former Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans and Fisheries. He also served Director for Ocean and Polar Affairs at the United States Department of State. An outstanding panel, and we thank them very much for their time and their effort. Mr. Secretary General, with that very brief introduction, allow me to turn this virtual floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and greetings from rainy Geneva. It's already late evening here, but I'm happy to join you from here. And I would like to share you some slides concerning the status of Arctic and how the future of Arctic looks like from the perspective of a climate science organization like WMO that I have been leading for the past 6 years. I will share my screen with you, and I hope that you can see it now. So WMO is the United Nations specialized agency on weather and climate, and we have practically all of the UN members are also our members, and most of our work is done by our members. We are coordinating the work of meteorological and hydrological services, academia, and also growingly private sector. And we are hosting IPCC, which is providing scientific reports on climate, and we are just in the process to publish the 6th assessment report. And I'm personally also a member of Secretary General Guterres Climate Core Group, and we are preparing this COP26 meeting at the moment. This is what we know about the temperatures. You can see that we have seen already from 1.1 to 1.3 degrees warming, depending on which center is calculating this time series since 1850s. And you can see on the map here that during the past 5 years we have seen anomalies, especially in the Arctic. And there's one special feature in the Arctic, which is the cooling that seems to be happening south of Greenland and Iceland, and that's most likely related to the slowing down of so-called the Gulf Stream. But Arctic, of course, globally, it's a special area on our planet. And we have seen an increase of the main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, and the same trend that has been observed at Mauna Loa has been also observed in the Arctic. For example, at the Finnish Pallas station, the amplitude is a little bit higher, but the overall average concentrations are the same, and the trend has been the same as in case of Mauna Loa. And we are dealing with the carbon budget, and you can see that the fossil carbon is clearly dominating this picture. And land use is contributing about 14% of the challenge, and that's mainly deforestation in the tropical areas. And oceans serve as a sink of carbon, and so do forests, and the remaining part stays in the atmosphere, which is this light blue area here. And we have seen deforestation, especially in South America and Africa, whereas in most northern hemisphere areas, we have seen either zero or slight increase of the forest cover. And this climate change has been contributing to the more intense growth of forests, and that's why we have started seeing growing amount of biomass there. One forest-related challenge in the Arctic is that we have started seeing also heat waves and drought, and that's why we have started seeing growing amount of carbon dioxide emissions coming from wildfires, and so far the record has been broken in 2020, a year ago. We have stored more than 90% of the excess heat to the oceans, and this is partly contributing to the sea level rise, besides melting of the glaciers. And once oceans serve as a sink of carbon, we have also changed the chemical composition of the seawater, and there's an estimation that the pH is now lowest in 25 million years. And I'm sure that you have seen these ice cover graphs demonstrating that both the spring and autumn ice covers are shrinking, and there's this year-to-year variability. And then we have seen also intensified loss of ice mass in the glaciers, and especially Greenland has been losing a record amount of its ice mass. And I'm sure that you're also aware of this ice mass changes in the Arctic. We have practically lost multi-year ice from the Arctic, and we have mostly 1 to 2 years old ice left nowadays. And by 2040s, we expect that the shipping routes will be open in summertime and autumn time, but the winter will still persist. And you should keep in mind that especially these Russian Arctic sea routes are fairly shallow, which means that the biggest container ships couldn't be used in that area. And IMF has estimated that this already seen 1 degree warming has had a positive impact on the economies of high northern latitudes. It's a longer growing season, the forests are growing better, and we need less energy for heating of the premises. And the future in the Arctic looks such that we expect to see at least double the global warming. So if we would reach 2 degrees globally, which is this blue curve, which are these blue curves here, we would reach between 4 to 5 degrees in the Arctic, and in winter time around 7 degrees warming. And if we fail with mitigation, then the numbers would be fairly dramatic, up to 10 degrees on annual average, and around 13 degrees during winter time. This is from the most recent IPCC report, what's going to happen to the rainfall amounts, which is on the upper panel here, and what's going to happen to the soil moisture, which is in the lower panel here. And dependent on the warming rate, 1.5 to 4 degrees, we would see anyhow more rainfall in the Arctic, and in most cases we would still see a growth of the soil moisture in almost all of the cases. And the World Resource Institute has estimated what might happen if we would reach 3 degree warming, what would happen to the crop yield worldwide. And you can see lots of reddish color, which indicates loss of crop yield, whereas at the high northern latitudes, we see lots of green color, which indicates again that basically the agricultural conditions are improving there, but the soil is not the most suitable, and of course this solar radiation is limited, so it wouldn't solve this loss worldwide. And finally, a couple of words about perspectives of mitigation. You know, of course, that the biggest emitter today is China, And number 2 here, you can see rest of non-OECD countries where emissions have been growing also fairly rapidly. And number 3 is USA, and thereafter it's OECD Europe. And the challenge that we have ahead of us is that we produce 85% of the global energy for energy production, industry, and transport sector based on nuclear, based on fossil fuels, and only 15% based on nuclear, hydro, renewables. Good news is that many of the Arctic countries have been able to reduce their emissions during the past 15 years. You can see Denmark, Finland, Sweden, USA, and Norway, which have been dropping their emissions, and at the same time, in all cases, we have seen economic growth. So this is positive news. And we are just preparing for this COP26 meeting, which will start in 1 month's time. And at the moment, we have pledges which would indicate 2.7 degrees warming. And from the UN side, we would like to see at least the upper limit of Paris Agreement, 2 degrees target, much more on the table. There have been lots of political promises, but the concrete pledges have been still missing. And finally, what this climate change means from global perspective, we would lose lots of agricultural productivity worldwide, and these Arctic areas wouldn't fully compensate the loss of crop yield in those areas. And it has been shown that the mitigation is much cheaper than living with the consequences of climate change. And the USA is the country where these expenses have been highest so far. And then it's a challenge for the oil and gas dependent economies like Russia, how to cope if you would really start leaving the resources in the ground, and that would be a challenge for such countries. And Africa is the most challenging area worldwide with population growth and poorer climate in the future. And also in Southern Europe, we would see challenges in the future. And finally, what is supposed to happen in the Arctic? I already demonstrated that we would see more than double world average warming, and especially during the winter season. And in the summertime, the risk for forest fires is growing, and that's what we have already been seeing in practically all parts of the Arctic. Rainfall, we expect to see more rainfall, especially during the winter season, and the growing season is already getting longer, and which has positive impacts on forests and agriculture, but we will also see natural variability in the future. And this melting of snow, ice, and permafrost and glaciers will continue for at least hundreds of years, or even thousands of years, because we have already been reaching high carbon dioxide concentrations, and I also demonstrated that we are going to see opening of the shipping routes, but one should keep in mind that the winter with sea ice still prevails, and there's a risk for major packed ice conditions, which would be an obstacle for the shipping. Sea level rise will continue for the coming centuries anyhow, and the range is from 0.3 meters per century, and in the worst case we could see up to 2 meters sea level rise per century if especially the Antarctic melting would take place in a speedier manner. And what happens in the Arctic, Antarctic glacier is having a big impact on the Arctic sea level future. And then there's a risk that we would see much more these kind of stagnant weather conditions blocking highs, which would mean in summertime heat waves and drought, and in wintertime cold patterns. And again, this would mean that the low pressure areas would have same tracks, and which would enhance risk for flooding and of course mild winter conditions as well. And then there are certain risks that we have to follow. Acidification of the seawaters, that's clearly one of the risks, and then what's going to happen to the methane and carbon dioxide that has been stored in the frozen wetlands. That's a question. So far, we haven't seen a major outbreak, but that's something that we have to follow. With these words, thanks for the opportunity to address you, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions later on. Thank you.
Secretary General, thank you so very much for covering a lot in a very short period of time. I do have some questions, as the audience will come back around to those, but I think one particular theme I'd like to think about when we come back around to some questions is this, that these are my words, but in some ways, everything that you have just noted is baked into the climate system. So your note, this sense of urgency here on all of our part, the fact that permafrost will continue to thaw, glaciers will continue to melt, sea ice will continue to recline. These are all baked into the current global climate system, no matter what we do today or in the next decade. And so what all those things you just addressed, they will be with us, our grandchildren and our grandchildren's children for quite some time, hence the urgency in getting as much as we can done in a short period of time to mitigate what is really out 50 years, 100 years. But we're dealing with what we're dealing with now, and there's no way to stop it now. So thank you very much for that. I do want to come back and touch that a little bit, including the ways in which you are trying to communicate this, the different ways you're trying to communicate the very situation that we are in, and how we can at least adapt and mitigate in the short to long term all the issues that you just discussed, because we're all trying to do the very same things that you are doing. So thank you very much for covering so much in so little time, and we will come back to some questions. With that, now I'd like to Ambassador Uudemeke, please take over the floor and your presentation, and I look forward to your comments as well.
Thanks very much, Michael. Greetings from the deserted foreign ministry. It's even later here than it's in Geneva, and I have no idea if it's raining. It's pitch dark outside. Thanks for the invitation. Over the past year and a half, I've very much enjoyed the Polar Institute's webinars. They've really been top of the line, very interesting and thought-provoking. As I listened to the Secretary General, I realized that there's no way I can match his scientific knowledge, not even close. So I think the best that I can do is to offer a few reflections on the theme of our discussion today. It also occurred to me that quite possibly this is the first international webinar in recorded modern history that has two persons by the name of Petteri in the panel. It's not that common of a name up here either. I'm just saying that. And knowing where Mike's from and staying with the issue of climate and the Arctic, and as Michael referred to and Heli did, Finland and Norway just conducted a joint trip to Alaska. Mike was there as well. And I've understood from Heli and the other colleagues in the embassy that it was an excellent trip. In fact, Heli has repeated that fact to me several times, and I take her word for it. And I do hope that the trip will lead to new concrete ways in connecting the US Arctic with us here in the Nordic countries even more strongly. We share many similar challenges and stand to gain from increased exchanges. And hopefully we'll be able to host a delegation of Alaska in Finland soon. On a personal note, if I may also say that a trip to Fairbanks, Alaska was the first pandemic-related trip that I had to cancel in March of 2020. I was already in transit in Stockholm, and late in the evening, my US colleague texted me a message saying, "Petteri, I hope you're not yet on your way. It's been cancelled." And ever since, one of the biggest objectives that I have in this post, that I would actually one day get to Fairbanks, Alaska. So Mike and all the other people listening in Fairbanks, Alaska, can you please take note of that? I'd love to come there. With regard to my country's relations with the United States, I'd like to also note that our president, Sauli Niinistö, and the special envoy, John Kerry, have exchanged views on the Arctic and the importance of increasing ambition, for example, in reducing black carbon and methane emissions. That work continues within the Arctic Council, particularly in its expert group on black carbon and methane, the EGBCM, as we affectionately refer to it. And we should really make sure that this super year for climate diplomacy helps to highlight this work globally. With regard to climate, and obviously being Finland's senior Arctic official to the Arctic Council, when someone starts talking about climate to me, I start talking about Arctic Council to them, and I never stop talking about the Arctic Council. When people get very tired of me talking about the Arctic Council, I then start talking about the Antarctic Treaty, which I think is also of tremendous importance. In the Arctic Council, this year we celebrate our 25th anniversary. And I was very pleased to be in Reykjavik in May when the 8 foreign ministers and the permanent participants reached an agreement on the Reykjavik Ministerial Declaration and our first ever strategic plan taking us to 2030. I think both are good documents, in my humble opinion. I've spent tens and tens of hours in the spring drafting them with my colleagues, and I can just assure everybody that drafting documents virtually is not fun, to put it mildly, but I'm very glad that we got there in the end. The Russian Federation is currently at the helm of the Council, and quite possibly they have the most charged and ambitious program ever. If I was to take part in all their planned events, I think I would basically need to move to Moscow or somewhere in Russia. There's an enormous amount of events which are being planned. I have kept saying that the Arctic cooperation does offer a way for constructive engagement with the largest Arctic state, the Russian Federation, despite the challenges elsewhere. The important thing, however, is to ensure that climate change continues to remain at the very top of the Arctic Council's agenda and priorities, together with the rights of the indigenous people and sustainable development throughout the region. The importance of the climate change was also very clearly acknowledged in our own national Arctic policy strategy, which we released early in the summer and presented to the diplomatic representations in Helsinki just a few weeks ago. And I'm sure that the European Union's new Arctic strategy, the joint communication, which will come out next week, will also highlight the importance of climate and climate change. Mike, since science is the other important theme in this webinar, there again, I'd like to underline the key role of the Arctic Council in that regard. And I think the Council is very successful in pulling together the scientific experts and producing high quality reports on a variety of themes. I think the importance of these reports has been acknowledged throughout the world. The work that our experts in our working groups do is really the engine of the Arctic Council. And I'd like to use this occasion, if there should be any delegates in any of our working groups listening to this discussion, to just wholeheartedly offer my sincere appreciation and gratitude for your devotion and commitment. I think you all do a very, very important work. I think all the Finnish delegates are probably fast asleep by now, but I'm sure there are others around the world that might be listening. The key issue for us and for the whole of humanity would be to study further the impact of climate change, but also the impact of climate change. The climate change, as we all know, will have an impact on the environment and meteorological circumstances in the Arctic region and beyond. But then these impacts will further cause loss of human life and money because of the thawing permafrost, flooding, landslide, and countless other impacts. In this regard, the work underway in the Council's AIM-UP and CUF working groups on the assessment of climate change and its impacts on Arctic ecosystems and ecosystem feedbacks will be of particular importance the world around. The climate change is an existential planetary level threat which is already underway and which has moved forward and will move forward. It presents us with a clear and present danger, however one looks at it. Ignorance, complacency, and apathy are the worst we could now do. Because of the Arctic amplification, the Arctic region is at the very center of this process. The AMAP working group refers to threefold increase of temperature in the Arctic, whereas the IPCC refers to more than twice. And I think the Secretary General just said at least twice. If there still are people in doubt of the impact of our actions, I would imagine that the most recent IPCC report should put those doubts in rest by concluding, and I quote, that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. To someone not trained in climate science like myself, that sounds convincing, way beyond any threshold of reasonable doubt. In my current function, I will tirelessly try to do my little part in increasing awareness of the problem and ensuring that the Arctic Council remains equipped to play its role. I also owe that to my two children, because it will be their world that we're talking about, not mine, not yours, and not ours. Many of the changes taking place in the Arctic are, sadly, already irreversible. To quote again the IPCC report, if I may, quote, many changes due to past and future greenhouse gas emissions are irreversible for centuries to millennia, especially changes in the ocean, ice sheets, and global sea level. The reports both by the IPCC and AMAP make it clear that the Arctic which we currently have is not the same Arctic we had in the 80s, and the Arctic of today will not be the same Arctic we will have in the 2050s. My son turned 20 a few weeks ago, and I wonder what will his world be like when he gets to be my age, and that thought worries me. To stop, slow down, control, and adapt to all of this requires that our scientists spare no effort in revealing all the facts and all the predictions, however unpleasant it will be to hear them. We, diplomats, in turn, must give that process all our support. In the Arctic Council, we have also the legally binding agreement on scientific cooperation, which is a useful instrument, and the Arctic Science Ministerials are very important gatherings of our scientists around the participating countries. And I look forward to the Arctic Science Ministerial, the fourth Arctic Science Ministerial, to be hosted by the Russian Federation and France in the next couple of years. In concluding, on science and education, I feel obliged, and I want to also highlight the role and great work of the University of the Arctic Network, the UArctic, which is hosted by the University of Lapland here in Rovaniemi, Finland. I attended a few weeks back their celebrations for their 20th anniversary and delivered an address together with my US, Russian, and French colleagues. The UArctic currently has 200 members in nearly 20 countries and has activities in about 60 different thematic networks. That is an impressive achievement, in my humble opinion. The final word that I just want to cite is to cite the letter that the president and vice president of the UArctic sent just before the celebratory event a few weeks back. And they said something that stayed with me. They wrote, quote, as an investment in human capacity, education is key component in any effort to create a sustainable future for the North and the globe. Universities are drivers of new ideas and communities of knowledge, and UArctic is an expression of such community on a regional scale. I can't really put it better myself. And with that, I rest my case, and thank you very much, Mike.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. Again, several notes here that perhaps we'll have time to circle back to. One is I am so very pleased that you mentioned Lars Kullerud and our friends at UArctic. We've long been associated with them. We feel the same, that there is a power in bringing together the intellectual capacity of the institutions around the North in service to the North. And I'm very pleased that you highlighted that work that has grown so much over the last 2+ decades, from sharing courses to now sharing common solutions to common challenges. That's really very much appreciated. I also took note of the rest of your task list, starting with the groundbreaking note that we have 2 Petris on this program. We'll see if we can strive to find the third for some future program. I should note to my colleagues abroad that we had some problem with the audio at the very beginning, but this whole program will be posted on our website. So no doubt you will be able to listen to the comments you may have missed. Third on the punch list is an invitation to Fairbanks, Alaska, and I think Alaska would welcome you with open arms, Mr. Ambassador. So you just need to tell us when, and when the world allows, we'll make that happen. You noted the Venn diagram of your president, who has been very, very vocal, very well received on both black carbon and the issue of methane, not just in the Arctic, but globally. And I've had the pleasure of speaking with him about that, and the discussion with Secretary Kerry. That's noted. And then with my other new hat as the incoming chair of the United States Arctic Research Commission, I'm most interested in all of your comments related to how countries around the North can harness their scientific and research expertise and leverage all of that for the good of the Arctic. No one country can do this alone. So thank you for all of that, including underscoring the importance of probably the most consequential organization we have in place at the moment, which is the Arctic Council. So thank you very much for, again, covering so much in so little time. Now onto our third colleague, TJ Matamore, who serves as the president of Vaisala. And TJ, thank you for allowing me to use the more common note for your name, now Timothy, as preferred. But I want to thank you for being with us today. And if you would not mind, would you please introduce your colleague that's joining you today as well? And I will turn the virtual program over to you.
Certainly. And unfortunately, my colleague here is not a Petri, but we have plenty of Petris at Vaisala over in Finland. But this is our in-house meteorologist, Chris Bagaski, and he is much more knowledgeable than I on a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So I am very happy that he'll be joining us. So I'll just introduce a few things quickly and then turn it over to Chris, but let me share my screen here. Okay, so hopefully you can see the slides at this point. So Vaisala is a company based in Vantaa, Finland, just north of Helsinki. We've had a wonderful working relationship with Heli and the ambassador's office here in DC for many, many years. And we are based right now in Louisville, Colorado, just outside of Boulder. It is 75 and sunny here, so I feel a little bit guilty talking about polar issues, but we'll take the good weather while we can get it. But Vaisala has been providing observations for a better world throughout our 85-year history. We do that through the manufacture of leading environmental measurement products, and we're getting more into the data world. And what I think Chris can provide and we at Vaisala can provide is a little bit more of how these observations are being taken in the Arctic and Antarctic regions and some of the challenges therein. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris. I'm going to give him the captain's chair here and let him steer from here.
Okay, well, thank you, TJ, and thank you everybody for joining us today on what is really an important topic, which is how are we measuring and how are we reacting to the changing climate in both the Arctic and the Antarctic regions. And as TJ had mentioned, we do a lot of environmental measurements. And from the WMO here is the essential climate variables that we try to measure. And there's 54 of these that go across the spectrum from the ocean to the atmosphere, the cryosphere, and things that the humans are doing to the planet that we live on. And Vaisala can measure a wide assortment of these essential climate variables, ranging from lightning to clouds, just the surface pressure, the temperature, even some of the sea state conditions like the sea surface temperature and wave conditions. And so to be able to touch so much of these different variables that have an impact on the changing climate and how that's going to impact people, the plants and animals as we go into the future, it really is very meaningful to work for a company that can do this and provide that information to those researchers, those scientists, those policymakers that are determining how we're going to react to a changing climate. Now, when it comes to measuring things in the Arctic, the Antarctic, and the polar regions at large, there are some challenges. And one is the extreme conditions that that exist. Yesterday, when the researchers at the South Pole launched their weather balloon, it was negative 65 degrees Celsius at the surface. So it was much, much colder than it is here in Colorado, there in Fairbanks, in Helsinki, in Geneva. It's also extremely challenging to get to these places, very remote locations. And then you want to have very good data quality. So kind of right in the middle there, you need something that is robust, potentially autonomous, and very, very accurate. We're going to go a few million miles away to talk about this. This is the Mars rover. So this is the Perseverance rover. And we are measuring some of those same essential climate variables that we're measuring here on Earth on Mars with some of our technologies. So this is some of the first data that was given back from the Perseverance rover. And this is the air pressure on Mars over about a 10-minute period. And you can see how the air pressure has changed with a little dip in air pressure and then a rise in air pressure over just a very short period of time, potentially as one of the very common dust devils on Mars passed by the rover. So if we can measure very accurately, precisely, and get that information back from another planet, being able to do similar things in the polar regions where it's very remote, very extreme conditions, should be something that we're able to do as well. And we do some of that. We're going to talk today about atmospheric sounding, so weather balloons and lightning detection. But with the technologies that Vaisala has, we can really measure a wide assortment of these essential climate variables that we've seen on the first slide that we looked at. And we'll talk first about weather balloons. Weather balloons have been launched for over 100 years, coming up on 110, 120 years now. Vaisala has at least a dozen of our systems in the Arctic and Antarctic regions that are measuring from the surface to the stratosphere, temperature, humidity, wind speed direction, the air pressure. And you can connect these sensors as well to other external sensors like ozone sondes, so that you can get a picture of multiple essential climate variables, so ozone, temperature, pressure, throughout the entire column of the atmosphere. And some of these are being measured in very extreme locations. As I said, right there at the South Pole, we have the weather balloons that are going up daily and temperatures that are negative 65 Celsius or colder in the wintertime. But we've also installed a network of autosondes, which are automatic balloon launchers, so that you don't have to send people out into the elements across Alaska, including in Fairbanks, Kotzebue, at Utqiagvik. And then there's other researchers across the northern stretches of the world and the southern stretches that are using these sensors to get a better picture of how temperatures and how winds are changing at all levels of the atmosphere over time. Now, polar lightning data, it needs to be interpreted with caution. And there's been a lot of talk about increasing lightning over the Arctic. But when you think about it, we've only been able to remotely sense lightning over the poles for about 15 years. And that doesn't give us a long period of time, a long period of record to do data interpretation. In lightning sparse regions like the Arctic and the Antarctic, the number of lightning events detected is going to be dominated by the number of thunderstorms and how intense they are. And if you have a very lightning sparse region, if you have one or two storms in one year and not the next, your numbers are going to fluctuate wildly. And we'll see that in the coming slides. So our lightning detection network, we have a global lightning detection network that detects lightning 360 degrees around the world from pole to pole. I've noted the Arctic and Antarctic circles here in red. So you can see that these really are very sparse regions for thunderstorm activity when you compare it to the Great Plains of the United States or Central Africa, Southeast Asia, Northern Australia, which are some of the more commonly known lightning hotspots. But as the Secretary General had shown, wildfires in the Arctic is going to be a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And with lightning in those regions, they can actually trigger more wildfires, which can trigger more greenhouse gas emission releases. So monitoring and having an effective network of lightning detection sensors to monitor changes in thunderstorm activity and lightning activity in these polar regions is an especially critical data source for helping to monitor climate change in these regions. And we'll look at the last 7 years, and I haven't put in the 2020 data here yet, but this is lightning that we've detected north of given latitude bands. So at the top there in the blue is north of 70 degrees and then down to north of 85 degrees. And you can see at the north of 70 and north of 75, there's been not much of a real increase or decrease in lightning north of those regions between 2012 and 2019, whereas you can see more substantial increase north of 80 degrees. And north of 85 degrees, where lightning is extremely rare, you can see that fluctuation from year to year of whether there is a thunderstorm or two thunderstorms. In 2019, we detected more lightning that year north of 85 degrees than in any of the previous years. And then in 2020, we actually detected even more lightning north of 85 degrees north than in even 2019. What really kind of got our attention in 2019 was that frequency of lightning north of 80 and then north of 85. And the National Weather Service in Fairbanks, Alaska had actually noted a substantial thunderstorm north of the Arctic Circle, north of Alaska. And we started looking more and more into lightning in these high latitude regions. And we actually detected August 13th of 2019, the furthest north lightning detection on record. It was just 52 kilometers from the North Pole. It was actually about 5,500 miles due north of where I'm sitting right now, or 5,500 kilometers due north of where I'm sitting right now. So we had multiple thunderstorms on August 13th that developed south of the North Pole and then moved north over the pole and then back south. So very uncommon phenomenon here to have this cloud to ice lightning that we were detecting this far north. And as I said, last year we actually detected even more lightning than in 2019. Some of the preliminary numbers that I've looked at for north of 70 degrees is that we may have detected even more this year than in the previous 2 years. So all of this data that we're collecting, whether it's through lightning detection, through weather balloons, or even through automatic weather stations, and many of the other technologies that we've developed here at Vaisala will be especially important for the atmospheric and other climate researchers who are trying to understand exactly how climate change is impacting these very remote extreme places on our planet and polar regions. Where are we going to be headed next? Well, I mean, we're just going to be following the data. We're truly believing in better measurements leading to a better world. So we are going to continue to keep our curiosity, look to see what other technologies we can develop and modify to help us better understand some of these essential climate variables that we maybe aren't measuring yet, or the ones that we are measuring. How do we take that data to the next step, turn that into actionable information for the policymakers, for the researchers, and see what we can do to help mitigate some of the effects of climate change. So again, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to listen in today, for inviting us to talk about some of what we do, and we'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much. Boy, do I have a number of them. But TJ, any comments before I make a few comments and then move on to our colleague, Evan Bloom?
Well, first off, I'm very glad I brought my colleague here. But besides that, yeah, it's very motivating for us at Vaisala to be on the front lines of providing the equipment and the data that groups like the WMO and groups all over the country here in the US and around the world can use. And it's something that we take very seriously, and we're very motivated to do so. And again, we're very proud to represent Finland. I think we were what Heli was referring to as the honorary Finns on the call, I believe. But you know, Finland is really on the front lines and doing a lot of work in this area, and it's just an honor to be carrying that banner here in the U.S. and around the world.
Well, thank you both very, very much. The issue of lightning strikes on or near the North Pole is just absolutely frightening for a number of situations and a number of perspectives. But we'll come back to that, and I'm even asked the Secretary General for his thoughts about this whole idea about observing networks. How much capacity do we collectively have in the Arctic? Where are the gaps? How does the international community fill the gaps in monitoring and observing so that we can make better, more informed decisions, not just about our research assets, but also how those assets are funded and how they may come about in terms of informing good, solid policy. And so maybe, Mr. Secretary, once Evan is done, I can put you on the spot, if you don't mind, sir, and ask you about that connection between what we just heard and where the WMO is going as well, if you don't mind. But I'll reserve that until Evan is done. But thank you so much. And thank you to our colleagues there at the Vaisala. Next is our good friend and colleague, Evan Bloom. As many of you know, Evan served as the former acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans and Fisheries. I will note that Evan had both portfolio for the Arctic and the Antarctic region, which is why I find his participation today important, but also seek his guidance often on issues within the Polar Institute. So Evan, let me turn over the floor to you.
Mike, thank you very much indeed. And I'm very pleased to be part of this panel with very distinguished experts and officials. So I thought I'd add some additional thoughts about climate policy and using science to advance climate policy. At first, I had some reactions and thoughts about the Finnish Arctic policy that was recently introduced to other countries and international stakeholders. Now, its first priority is mitigating and adapting to climate change. And it's certainly appropriate that climate change is the first of the 4 priorities. The new Finnish Arctic policy provides a clear statement of specific steps that Finland plans to take consistent with EU policy. It integrates Arctic policy and climate change policy, something arguably not yet achieved in US policy. Arctic policy, as a general matter, doesn't make a lot of sense without considering climate policy. So in my view, this integration is rather important. So my hope is that when the Biden administration releases a new public Arctic policy, updating the Obama one that is still in effect, that it will provide for the same type of integration of climate policy. So the third listed priority is expertise, livelihoods, and leading edge research. And the research part connects well, certainly, with the climate change piece. As the policy points out, Finland has research infrastructure that is unique by international standards for observing climate and environmental change in the Arctic region, as well as for space research and ice research. And Finland is, of course, famous for its ice-breaking technology. The new Arctic policy also fits well with the historic work of the Arctic Council, which is focused on sustainable development and environmental protection. And I certainly very much support the comments made by the ambassador about the council, and I'll try not to overlap too much with those comments. But how does the Arctic Council fit with all this? The Council, from its inception 25 years ago, has been about cooperation regarding the environment. And except for the US during the last administration, the Arctic states as a group have been pulling in much the same direction in emphasizing and leading on climate policy. And with the advent of the Biden administration, the US is now able to rejoin efforts within the Arctic Council that address climate issues and connections to the Arctic. The Arctic Council is a good forum for some of these discussions because of the presence of the permanent participants, the indigenous groups that sit at the table along with the states. They can bring indigenous perspectives on climate issues in the Arctic, so both indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge are both taken into account. Arctic science is important for all the Arctic states, as is science-based decision-making for Arctic governance. The Council has given rise, as was mentioned, to 3 legally binding agreements among the 8 Arctic states, and one of these promotes Arctic science by attempting to lower the barriers to scientists seeking to work within the various territories of the Arctic. The Council has a series of working groups, as already mentioned, that focus on technical issues with government scientists and other experts. So also those who follow the Council's work will know about the groundbreaking Arctic Climate Impact Assessment from 2004. It was the first comprehensive multidisciplinary assessment of the impacts of climate change in the Arctic, and was designed to provide input to policymakers as well as to the IPCC. Now, this initiative seems like a while ago now, as does some of the work done under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change some years ago, but all of this provided a foundation for the immense, very sophisticated efforts that are now going on to address the climate crisis. So there's a keen connection among Arctic science, the work of the Arctic Council on climate issues, and the issues to be grappled with slowly at COP26 in Glasgow. But back to the Arctic Science Cooperation Agreement for a moment. That agreement was signed by the ministers in 2017. So all Arctic states are parties, but it is perhaps worth mentioning that the US and Russia were driving forces behind the agreement. It's thus an example of cooperation with Russia in the Arctic and on science matters that is and was possible despite all the other tensions that exist on other issues. The pandemic has reduced international scientific efforts in the Arctic by a certain amount, as scientists have not been able to cross borders in particular. As the pandemic recedes, hopefully things will get back to normal, and the Science Cooperation Agreement and other tools can be used to increase international collaborations throughout the Arctic. I'm glad that Ambassador Vuorimäki referred to the efforts of UArctic. It and a host of educational institutions are critical to efforts to study Arctic environmental change and a host of related topics. And I'm also very pleased that the ambassador mentioned that he moves to the Antarctic Treaty when he wants to, when he gets a glazed look if he mentions the Arctic Council. So I'll mention Antarctic issues for a moment. This panel is, of course, about climate science at both poles, and at least that was the title. And it's worth reminding ourselves of the importance of science going on in the South as well as in the North. Indeed, both Finland and the US are leaders when it comes to Antarctic governance and to science at both poles. So work is going on in Antarctica that is crucial to understanding the climate system. And certainly studies of glaciology tell us much about issues of sea level rise, glaciology in Antarctica, in the same way that studies in Greenland provide critical information and a necessary warning for our societies. So, Mike, I think I will stop there and turn it back to you.
Thank you, Evan. Mr. Ambassador, I saw your hand up. Do you want to follow up briefly before I move on to the questions?
Yeah, if I may, just say that I very much appreciated Evan's insightful analysis. Just a few quick comments just to add that the Arctic policy strategy that we released, it was a process led by our Prime Minister's office. It was a truly collaborative exercise with all the ministries. The international context overarches all the priorities. I mean, that was a conscious choice that we did. The thought being that we can't do anything in isolation or in a vacuum. Everything we do in the context of international cooperation. The strategy very much underlines the role of the Arctic Council and of the 8 Arctic states, but does open and acknowledges that wider cooperation, for example, in science, is needed. One of the novelties of the strategy was that there was, for the first time ever, a brief section on the Antarctic, as you may have noticed. And as my country's first ambassador that covers both the Arctic and the Antarctic, I find it strong position by Finland to be one of the only 5 countries in the world who are both members of the Arctic Council and the Antarctic Treaty. There are the others are the United States, Russian Federation, Norway, and Sweden. And I look very much forward to welcoming the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting to Helsinki in the spring of 2023. And on the Arctic Council, environment, climate change, yes, absolutely. But there are also new challenges facing the Council from various directions. And we just need to ensure that the Council is ready to face these challenges. Thanks a lot. And thank you again, Evan. Thank
you. Just for our colleagues in the audience, just remind you one more time, you can email us at polar@wilsoncenter.org with your questions or comments. But I'd like to come back, Mr. Secretary General, to the questions I wanted to ask you in no particular order, but to start with our friends from Wisla. The Arctic, it's a huge area to cover, right? Like many other places on the planet. But from your perspective, how are we doing in terms of our observing networks, our capacity to understand what is happening in the North? And is it enough what the international community is doing at this point to inform and influence the work that you do, sir?
Yeah, from our perspective, we have 2 major interests. One is the other one is related to operational services, and for that purpose, our basic observing network is still too sparse. We are just about to set the new global standards for the observing systems. We will have our General Assembly, our Congress, in a couple of weeks from now, and there we are setting a new standard called the Global Basic Observing Network. We have already heard some concerns from Canada, for example, that they cannot afford having such a dense network, even in a wealthy country like Canada. And also Russia is having difficulties. They have fairly dense networks in the European part of the country, but the Siberia is also fairly fairly data sparse. And of course, these sea areas, that's also a challenge. So that means that the basic services in that region remain poor. If we would have more dense network, we would have better accuracy of our weather forecasts. And the other challenge is related to science and to understand what's happening to the oceans and atmosphere and the whole Earth system. And also there we have challenges and for example, Finland has been establishing greenhouse gas monitoring stations to Russia. The first station was established as a joint venture between USA and Finland and Russia to Tiksi, and we established another station to island the Bolshevik, which is a funny name, by the way. But anyhow, there's another station, and we are, for example, monitoring whether we are going to see some release of methane from the Arctic permafrost, and so far we haven't seen it happening. But this political situation is a slight challenge as well. For example, USA was forced to withdraw from these Tiksi operations because of some challenges with Russia already 10 years ago, but Finland has continued running those. And then my plea for Santa Claus is always that we should afford a satellite program which would have this kind of this elliptic Molniya orbit, and both NOAA and Canadians have been trying to set up such a program, and that would enhance this data gap that we are having there, and the Canadians established such a setup, but once they took the military on board, the mission became so expensive that the meteorological part was pulled out of the mission. So that's still something that I would like to see happening, and that would also comfort the need in Southern Hemisphere in the same way.
Well, thank you for that. Let me, if you don't mind, let me just follow up on that just very quickly, and we'll see what we can do. I just live a few miles from North Pole, Alaska, but I know all Arctic countries claim Santa Claus in one form or another. So we might as well all ask Santas from our region for these gifts. It can't hurt. Related to the costs of either whether it's geosynchronized or elliptical orbit satellites for data, you mentioned NOAA and the Canadian government, but I'm wondering, with all of the private industry now, all of SpaceX and all of these, incredible advances in such a what seems like a short period of time, I'm wondering, is there a combination within these public-private partnership sphere that could advance Arctic research as well?
That's a good question, and we have started seeing growing amount of private sector-driven satellite programs, and since these microsatellite programs are becoming more affordable for the private sector, that's already happening. But so far, we don't have dedicated Arctic ones. Finland has a company called ICEYE, which is providing some services, and they have been able to do it in a profitable way. But so far, it seems that it should be something financed by the public sector. But if at WMO, we are very much favoring public-private engagement, so joint ventures, and if such a window is we are able to open such a window, that would be great.
Thank you, and of course we're familiar with our friends at ICEYE and the work they're doing. It seems like maybe that's a new trend, especially since we're all struggling with how to provide good data for good policy. I have so many other discussions, questions about COP and other things. Maybe we'll have some time to come back to those. But Mr. Ambassador, a question to you about the Arctic Council here for a moment. And I'm glad you linked Arctic and Antarctic, as Evan did as well. But in terms of the Arctic Council, it is, the most consequential forum at the moment for Arctic nations and non-Arctic nations to participate in. I'm wondering what you see for the Arctic Council in the next few years, not chairmanship by chairmanship, but in terms of the expectations on the Arctic Council, right? I mean, it's now, it went from trying to explain to people what the Arctic Council is, and now has almost become a body that has the expectation level up pretty high to navigate so many issues. And what are your perspectives on its ability not to get into other areas, but to simply keep up with the rate of change in the North, knowing full well, as Evan pointed out, the history of where the Arctic Council came from and why it was created? What are your thoughts about its ability to keep up with the rate of change and so much that's going to be demanded of it in the next few years?
Thanks, Mike. The council will be faced with challenges. I'm convinced that we will be able to face the challenges, but a lot of work lies ahead of us. There are so many new things that we need to address: public health and the pandemics, the economic cooperation related aspects at large. Then there's a whole big issue with the marine governance and the BBNJ negotiations. And also really our interaction with our observers. I mean, we're a council of 8 member states and a permanent participant. We have 38 observers currently. Several had applied before the Reykjavik meeting. I am aware of several others who are planning to submit their observer application. So that's something that we need to reflect internally, and we will have ahead of us a strategic reflection during the Russian chairmanship, and I hope that will be conducive. I think some of the challenges one can read in the Reykjavik Declaration and the strategic plan that were adopted in May. But my firm conviction is that the Arctic Council shall remain the preeminent forum for circumpolar Arctic cooperation. I don't know who could possibly replace it, but it's not a free ride, and we need to reflect carefully how we thread forward.
Thank you so much. Maybe to now my colleagues at Vissala who noted the strategic allocation of their assets. You both noted the future role of the company and its efforts to serve the community. So back to the Secretary General's comments about the need for more robust observing networks, platforms, locations. Right? It's the terrain that you try to cover both in the Arctic and Antarctic are simply mind-boggling. How do you go about deciding your priority list? What are the priorities? Do those come from inside a corporate model, or do they come from external and the needs of the community to try to solve problems that we're currently all faced with in both polar regions?
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge. And what we do, one, as a company, is we look at how can we meet some of the UN guidance on certain policies. And then we also are listening to the weather community at large and what are their focuses. And so we want to work hand in hand with the people that are doing the measurements, people that have those measurement challenges, and the people that are taking that information and using that to make certain policies or make certain decisions based on those measurements. So we see ourselves kind of working together and bridging that gap between the policymakers and the people that are collecting the data to inform those decisions.
I think too, just a quick comment, there is probably a challenge, and Chris, feel free to weigh in on this, that we obviously generally sell to government entities and the like, and when there really is no country right at the pole and the North Pole, and then Antarctica is its own split between certain outposts, who is the customer in that scenario? So that gets a little bit complicated. We certainly want to do our part and serve the world at large as best we can, but But sometimes I think it's a challenge in terms of who's actually buying the equipment and why, and so that's something that we have to factor in. But one other thing that was mentioned is, we feel very strongly at Vaisala that there is the need to cooperate both with our observations at the surface level and up into the atmosphere, and then combine that with what satellites can do. That we don't feel like we're a competitor to satellites, and I hope they don't feel like we are. I think it's the production of a full data set from both what we cover and what the satellites cover that can provide the best data for the world at large to be able to forecast, compare, and make the determinations about climate change.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you very much. Evan, put you on the spot here about, I want to focus a moment about the Antarctic, and Secretary General, I'll come back to you for a follow-up. But Evan, you and I have talked a little bit more about this this dual emerging narrative. The Arctic now, you hear about the Arctic far more often today than you did even 5 or 10 years ago, right? Now you can throw a dart at a calendar. Odds are you're going to hit the date and there's going to be an Arctic meeting somewhere, some facet of the Arctic, which is music to many of our ears. But it's, free roaming, Miami, and there's meetings in Hawaii about the Antarctic and elsewhere in the world, which means about the Arctic, which means, in some ways we've done a good job collectively to elevate how important the Arctic is, and that everybody has equities in the North. You may not think you do, but you do. You have a connection to it. And so in some ways it's a good thing. But now I would argue, maybe it's just that we follow it a lot. The same is sort of happening with the Antarctic. It's a very different narrative, but we're hearing more and more about the Antarctic, mostly about the issues related to climate. So would you agree with my statement that we're hearing more and more about it, that we will maybe perhaps in a few years be talking about the Antarctic, maybe not as much, but close to the amount we do in the Arctic? And if so, what do you think those issues will be? Because we have a tendency to look for militarization and conflict in these regions versus shared challenges in these regions.
Well, Mike, I think part of this is an American and perhaps a Northern Hemisphere phenomenon. That is, if you go to Southern Hemisphere countries, if you talk to Chileans and Australians and others, they probably have a few more conferences and focus on Antarctica than you would find, say, up in Alaska. And I think that scientists in general, if you go to the National Science Foundation, they have an Office of Polar Programs. It's not just Arctic. They are focusing on Arctic and Antarctic science and the connections between the two. So especially as if you look at the work of the IPCC and others, I think they're valuing both. Antarctic policy and Antarctic science will become more and more in the forefront, especially when it comes to issues like sea level rise, where you can't really talk about that issue without looking at what's going on in Antarctica, not just Greenland and other places.
Thank you, Evan. Great perspective. We're winding down our time, and I really want to ensure that our guests have some time to finish up their comments, but I have one more question for the Secretary General. You noted, of course, we all know COP is coming up. There's so many issues to cover in COP. You mentioned, and there's everything. There's political, economic, there's food availability, parts of our world like the African continent, so many pressures there. Won't go into all of them. When you're there at COP, how will the Arctic resonate at COP? I mean, there's so many other incredible issues to address there. Do you see the Arctic elevating to a narrative equal to many of the other challenges related to the discussions that are happening there?
Yeah, of course, the key issue is to touch these emissions, and one of the questions, a couple of questions are related to this potential release of carbon dioxide or methane from the permafrost or from the bedrocks of the sea areas. So those are politically interesting things, and they are some sort of tipping points. So far, it hasn't been happening. But of course, everybody understands that that Arctic has seen the largest changes worldwide, and that's going to happen also in the future. So it has certain symbolic value, I would say. And of course, the Arctic countries are wealthy countries, and that's one dimension. And of course, we have a large part of the fossil fuel resources that we haven't been exploring so far. They're located in the Arctic, especially in the Russian Arctic, and that's a politically sensitive issue, whether we will leave them on the ground, which should happen if we would be successful in climate mitigation. And of course, we are paying also growing attention to climate adaptation. Many countries and many financing institutions have decided that they will allocate half of their financing for adaptation. And of course, once the infrastructures in the Arctic are about to collapse, and the sea level rise is having negative impacts on the coastal infrastructures. So that's also one dimension of the things that we are dealing with.
Well, I've never lied to a Secretary General before, but there's always a first time. So I want to ask you one more question, if I might. How do you feel going into COP? I mean, it's daunting. It's hard to, sort of be uplifted when you see so much that needs to get done. On the other hand, there are some areas where there has been some progress, even if it's just awareness. So how are you feeling going?
So I've been following this climate question since the 80s, and it's a big surprise for me personally how much we are talking about climate nowadays, and we have growing amount of countries which have at least at the political level they have promised to aim at becoming carbon neutral by 2050. That's the case in USA, and of course European Union countries. And China has said that it's 2060, and even countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia have said that they have the same target. But the concrete pledges they are still missing. So that's a challenge. But and what's happening also at the private sector nowadays, if you look at if you listen to the car manufacturers or energy sector, the conversion is going on, and I'm confident that we will be able to tackle this problem. But it's another question whether we are going to reach the Paris limits. So that's so far we are not yet there, but 2 degrees is not out of question fully. Of course, that means more than 4 degrees in the Arctic.
Thank you for that. Before I hand the program over to Heli for her last comments, I'm wondering if anyone else has some closing comments that you'd like to share. And Mr. Ambassador, perhaps I can start with you, and then our friends at Gisela, and then Evan, and then on to Heli. Mr. Ambassador.
Thanks very much, Mike. Very briefly, I have a sense that Arctic appears to be on everybody's mind that I talk to or hear about. I also have a sense that, and Mike, you alluded to that already, that the Antarctic shall be on everybody's mind as we move forward. I think the key shall be to understand that firstly, they're vastly different in terms of law, geography, history, but that there are some common challenges and common issues on climate, biodiversity, and others. And our fate, our future depends on our ability to address the challenges in both of the polar regions. And that calls for increased attention to the Arctic Council in the Arctic and to the Antarctic Treaty Mechanism in the Antarctic. It's only through international cooperation that we'll be able to succeed. Thanks.
Thank you for those wonderful comments. TJ, Chris, other comments, please.
I just wanted to, again, thank you for letting us participate. And again, we feel very motivated at Vaisala that the work that we do is more needed than ever. And it was difficult here in the US for a brief period of time to be in a country that seemed to be going against science and innovation as a science and innovation-based company. But now we're back on the right side of that, and I hope that continues forever. And we'll just do our best to continue to innovate and provide the best tools out there to be able to provide the measurements needed to combat this problem and hopefully make some significant progress warding off what we can in the future.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm so pleased that you joined us today. It's more of the providing an insight into the tools and the evolution of the tools and the application of the data that you have been able to secure through the deployment of these tools. That has been not just the most productive in terms of understanding what your community is doing for the scientific and research and policy community, but also having this loop effect where these all are connected. We certainly can't have sound policy without sound data and research and science and policy. So thank you very much. And now over to Evan Bloom. Evan, some final thoughts, please.
Just very quickly, Mike, I'm just so glad that this panel has been able to focus attention on polar science, which is not a luxury for the world. It is a necessity in order for us to get, in particular, climate policy right. And as we enter into the few weeks before Glasgow, this is a critical moment. But even after Glasgow, we're going to have lots of other key moments, and there needs to be strong funding for science at both poles, and the political leaders have to listen to what that science tells us. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Heli, let me turn the virtual floor over to you for your final comments before we close.
Thank you very much, Mike. Just to say thank you to all of you for such an interesting discussion. Many of you mentioned that we hear more about the Arctic and the Antarctic now, but we talked about the COP, but there is definitely always the need for more awareness raising, and the Embassy, together with Wilson Center and others, we look forward to providing one avenue of highlighting these messages. So just thank you to the Secretary General, Ambassador Vuorimäki and Vaisala for joining for this important discussion. And I wanted to also comment on what Evan, you mentioned many times, and others as well, that it's no coincidence that the portfolio at the Embassy, for example, has all three: Arctic, climate change, and sustainable economic development in one package. So for us, those are very much interconnected, as you mentioned. Yes, just continue looking forward to providing our services to strengthen the discussions that are ongoing and look for new ways of working together as well. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Heli. Again, all colleagues, thank you so very much for a really robust 90 minutes of discussion. We covered a lot of ground, and it's evident there's a whole lot more to do, but we will continue our work together. We hope to invite you back at a point that we can do that. Heli, thank you for the support of the Embassy and all of you. Secretary General, thank you so much for joining us from Geneva and taking time out of what must be just, we'll just say, a challenging schedule as you continue to advance on all nations' behalf, and I wish you the very best in COP. My friends and colleagues, I thank you again, and to all of you watching, the hundreds of you, thank you, not just our friends in the North, but around the world who continue to participate in these discussions. I wish you all a very good morning or afternoon and good evening, and look forward to our next time together. Thank you again.